So thanks for joining me for another Airbrush Asylum video. This is part 2 of the Grim Reaper tutorial. If you haven't checked out part 1, do so now. So let's get into part 2 right now. Okay, so I'm going ahead and using some Fleshtone. What I'm going to do is render the bone of the Reaper. But before I do that, I want to change this up a little bit. I'm actually thinking I'm going to put a skull in here just to make it look a bit different. So I'm going to use just the Fleshtone. I'm not going to go back to the white. The flesh will still opaque nicely over it. And this template here isn't by AirShot Stencils. This one I think is an old one I had from AirShot Stencils. And I'm just dusting that in just to get my basic outline. Now I'll come in and just render over the top with this bone colour. When I say bone colour, it's essentially a Fleshtone. If you want to know how to mix it, I've got a video on that and I'll pop that link in the description below. So just not really sold on that at this stage. So even though I want to put a skull in there, I don't really like the way that turned out. So I'm going to eliminate that with the graphite grey and we're going to lay in another skull in there. I think maybe it needs to be facing in the other direction, but it's a good little exercise to show you how to add things, then remove them again and get back to that original base and how to make everything blend in. This is good when you haven't got a pre-mixed colour that you have to try and match up again. This is just the graphite grey, so I've grabbed it again and opaquing over the top of it. I'm going to go with the smaller version of that same skull now, and I'm going to line up the top of the cranium basically to the blade, and this time it's facing the other way. So it's going to go ahead now and render that one. And come in with that Fleshtone. I'm happy with that already. I'm just going to merge that into here. And then I'll bring that blade in to the back of that cranium there. Before I do the blade, I'm now going to go over all the areas of the skull with this bone colour. So I've just coated over the skull with that bone colour. Sorry I missed most of that as I didn't lower the camera. Apologies for that. I'll use a bit of this bone Fleshtone colour on here as well. Okay, so I want to clean up the blade now before I start to render everything else. So I'm going to go back to my fine line and tape over the top of this, re-establishing that sharp edge, and we're going to run it into the back of the cranium of that skull that I added. And I'm also going to do the lower section. What I might do for some added effect is twist that one like so. Perfect. Now mask up around it. You want to do all this now, that way you get a nice clean edge and then you can still work your freehand airbrushing around it. Alright, so coming back in with my white, I'll run that white up to the back of that skull. While I've got it, I'll brighten up along here as well. It's one thing with canvas, I love the texture, but it makes it a lot harder to control your overspray. Just keep that in mind. Now I can go right over that because I know my transparent black will sit back over the top. So you always think about how you're going to approach an artwork, what colours you're going to use. You'll notice as well in this that I've done my Fleshtone. The next colour I'm going to use after repairing this section is a sepia brown, and that'll be all my shading for my skull, but it'll also be my flat colour for this timber section. So always plan it out so you minimise the amount that you have to clean your airbrush out. Just re-brighten that up. Might be able to get away with I'll get away with just using the freehand shield, and we'll just re-establish that shadow line. Now I'm going to aim for the top of that template, therefore getting my defined edge, and then I can unmask it. I should have a nice bladed edge, which I do. The rest I can do freehand. Much better. So it looks a bit funny because that part of the blade's sitting on the skull, but that'll all blend in at the end. Now I'm going to render with the sepia brown. Now I'm really wanting to pull out as much detail as possible now, even though I'm still going to come in later with the transparent black. But this tone now I want to establish as much detail as possible. Even just that sepia is already giving it lots of shape. So if this is the first time watching one of our videos, then welcome. For all of our regular viewers, welcome back. I do hope that you're enjoying this video so far. If you are, give it a thumbs up, share it out, and let's build this airbrushing community together. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing. Tap on that bell icon and that'll notify you every time I put out new content. We're still up really close here with that sepia brown, establishing the teeth, adding some real subtle textures. You see I'm dusting over certain areas just to shape it more. Another tip to see how you're going with your artwork: step back from your work and just have a look at it from a distance, and that'll give you an understanding of how you're travelling. And what I do is I also squint my eyes, or if I want to do that really easily, I just take my glasses off and everything goes blurry anyway. By doing that, you want to cut all of the detail out and just allow your eyes to see just the shapes and shadows. And then that way you can see if you're on the right track with that as well, especially if you're working on a reference. And if it's something like a portrait, for example, which has to be extremely accurate with your highlights and your shadows, then that method works really well. I know some people also like to turn their canvas or their artwork upside down, and then they just follow their reference that way. That also forces you to just paint what you see. A bit of shading in those bones. Let's finish adding the sepia here as well. Okay, so now I'm going to come in with some white highlights. I'll start on this skull here. Again, the reason I'm doing white now is because when I do my final tone, then it'll clean up any of the overspray, which is inevitable when you're working with white. So I find it's good practice just to do it as your second last tone, and then you don't have to worry too much about getting any overspray. Get a nice clean look. Just noticed I forgot a bit of sepia shadowing on there, so I'll go ahead and grab my other airbrush. Lucky I've got numerous airbrushes, I can just switch between them without having to wash out a brush just to put that in. Now I'll start to render the hood. So just continued that white down the cloak there. Sorry I missed that. Get a little bit carried away when I zoom in with the camera and then I get into the design and forget to move it, so apologies for that. But same sort of procedure as in the method that you saw initially in this section, is just sort of carried throughout to create those effects. Sort of making it up as I go. If you struggle with that, as I always mention, get yourself a reference and work off that. I like to just use the template as my basic guide originally, just to get my sketch on there, and then I like to freehand off that. But it does take a little bit more practice. So you can really see how that white now transforms the design and gives it its 3D appearance. Start to get some depth within the artwork. So I'm just sharpening those edges now. Pick up some of this shredded fabric. And then I'm going to do another layer of fire. So again, utilizing the flame templates. Build another lick on top. Now working on the final rendering now with transparent black. So using the Micron CMSB for this. Now I want to be careful only to put this in the darkest areas and to define my detail. I don't want to go over any of the highlights or anything that I've put in there. I want to be careful to keep them still looking nice and bright. I mean, worst case, if I did happen to go over a highlight in a spot, then I could put it back in. But obviously we don't want to do that if we don't have to. Do some texturing in there as well. So less is definitely more for this tone. So make sure your airbrush is nice and clean. If it's older paint, then I'd recommend straining it, because you don't want to, when you're working up this close on something that's reasonably fine in spots, then you know it could spurt out on you and you don't want that. You also don't want to eliminate all of the sepia that we've added. With the eye sockets, don't just go solid black. You'll notice there's some shape in there. Make this edge a bit more uneven. Just going to switch to white for the moment and pick up this edge of the blade just so I get some separation from the Reaper's cloak. The drop shadow there, just added in. You can see I didn't just go straight across, I've worked with the shape of the material. So be wary of that if you are going to add drop shadows in. Think about the surface that you're going to be shading on top of. They're getting through all the detailing of the cloak. That darker tone is really helping to make the artwork pop. Just sharpen up all of those details, add in all the shading to make it look a bit more three-dimensional. So you can see here I've got this part of the cloak in front of that timber section, the handle of the blade, and then I've got this part of the flame lick also in front, whereas this is behind. So I'm creating those layers of depth. So by doing, you know, little things like that can really improve your artwork as well. It's so simple to do. Just a bit of thought goes into it and you can really transform the look of the piece. So on the Reaper's blade, or better known as scythe, I'm going to add a bit more distressing to it. I think it looks a bit almost like a brand new blade, so I don't want that. So I'll just do a bit of freehand as well along the edges, just to dirty them up a little bit. Better already. Finish it off with some highlights as well, just to add a bit more realism to the texture. And just make these eyes glow. I was going to add a colour, but I don't think I'm going to. I'm going to have a little bit of the glow coming off, sort of a bit of a dagger stroke. Okay, so here is the completed Reaper on the canvas. Give you a little bit of a close-up. You can see the blade now with all those highlights and damage. Glow in the eyes. Detail in the robe. Moving down into where the robe starts to turn into the flame. So to continue your learning, be sure to check out some of the other videos and playlists that I've got listed here. And until next time, go grab your airbrush, do some amazing artwork yourself, and I'll see you again very, very soon in the next video. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.